My name is Joe Osa, and I'm here to speak about some of the issues with the Fountain Wind Project in this area. My background is I'm an electrical engineer, retired now. Spent most of my career working for DoD, satellite communication systems, and position navigation and timing systems. Well, I'm going to talk about a couple things that are problematic with these windmills in this particular area. One of the issues that I'm going to talk about has to do with the energy that these windmills produce, how they connect to the grid, and things of that nature. One of the things that you hear about a lot, and you hear this from the developers, that the windmill project will produce 216 megawatts of power, and people don't fully understand exactly what that means. That 216 megawatts is what they call nameplate capacity. That's the maximum power that all of the windmills combined would produce if they were operating at full capacity. Now, we know that that isn't how windmill developments operate. They don't run at full capacity all the time. In fact, there's a percentage of full capacity that they operate at that is referred to as the capacity factor. And so typically back in the Midwest, where the winds blow really strong, the capacity factor might be 30 to 35%. Out in this area where we have marginal or fair winds at best, the capacity factor is probably more like 20 to 25%. The nearby Hatchet Ridge project, which will be just a few miles from the Fountain Wind Development Project, has traditionally produced on that order of about 20 to 24% of their maximum capacity, what's their nameplate capacity. And so at that rate, to determine the number of homes, for instance, that would power, which is an important consideration if you're trying to decide if the impact to the environment and the carbon used to develop these things, transport, construct, and all of the issues that go into developing one of these in such nice forested lands is worth it. So you would weigh how many homes does this thing really power. Well, at a 25% capacity factors, these only power about 57,000 homes. And this is another important point, the developer uses the average energy per household that is optimum for the numbers they want to advertise. So for instance, you might hear 86 to 100,000 homes for this project. Well, that's using California's average power usage per year. And that's actually pretty low across the country, and even compared to Shasta County. Shasta County is, the average here is probably about 8,000 kilowatt hours per year. The Department of Energy estimates it's about 12,000 for the nation. The numbers used by the developer are more like 5,000 to 6,000 because that's the average across all of California. So we're really concerned about this power staying within Shasta County. We should use those numbers, and with those numbers, the number of homes powered is about 57,000. But the other problem that occurs that you need to consider too is how usable is this power. Just because it could theoretically power 57,000 homes, the other problem with wind turbines, and solar for that matter, is that it often produces power when it isn't needed. And so the wind blows best at night, and so, but that's exactly when you often don't need the power. And so the Cal ISO has already estimated that for the 2020 power year, they would curtail or take offline as much as 20% of the renewables produced in California. And so you could reduce that 57,000 by another 20%, which brings it down into the mid-40 range. The problem with that as well is this particular project, because it's locating in a high fire hazard zone, in fact the highest in the state. These forests here have some of the highest fire hazard zones in the state. And so as part of the mitigation for putting the local community at risk, and even the city of Reading should the winds blow in that particular direction, or Bernie should they blow in the other direction should a fire break out. As part of the mitigation plan for that, they have talked about not powering the windmills, or not curtailing them, or causing them to, cease to spin, to turn them off essentially, during red flag warning days. So not just PSPS events, which we already experience here, but the actual red flag warning days, which are usually precludes actual PSPS events. So that further reduces it by another 10% approximately. So the actual number of homes powered is much less than what you might hear advertised, is much less than the 86 to 100,000 homes, probably something more on the order of 20 to 40,000 homes, especially depending on where it goes. If this goes out of state, then we have to use that larger DOE number. So the carbon expenditure, the impact to the environment is just, it isn't worth the few number of homes that it powers. So another aspect with regard to this power that these windmills will generate is it safe to put it on the electrical grid? That's a big concern these days. We've experienced so many fires caused by PG&E's electrical grid. One of the objectives for this project is to locate within PG&E's territory. Therefore, we should look at PG&E's electrical grid and really examine that question. Unfortunately, in the DEIR that we just recently reviewed, the county, as the lead agency, isn't addressing that issue. There is no input from PG&E or the California Independent System Operator or the CPUC with regard to, is it safe to transmit this power on PG&E's electrical grid? We, in this area, already experienced significant PSPS events. We're usually the first to lose power and the last to get it back on. As I mentioned earlier, this area is rated the highest fire hazard zones by both the CPUC and CalFire. So it's an important question to address. One of the things that is looked at or is talked about by the developers, how this power will connect to a 230 kV line made available by PG&E from one of their pit generating plants, and that it will travel to Cottonwood. One of the reasons why Cottonwood is mentioned, vice the nearby Round Mountain substation, is because there is already identified by the CPUC and Cal ISO significant problems at the nearby Round Mountain substation. So much so that Cal ISO has issued a contract to rectify the problem there. At the Round Mountain substation, which is only maybe a mile or so from the turbine project, Fountain Wind Project, there's a voltage overload and voltage instability and thermal overload issue. They have issued a contract. I think the upper range of that is around a $200 million deal. It's supposed to be completed in the 2024 timeframe, and it's to address that issue. The problem with that is that when the voltage is too high, they can't perform maintenance on the lines, and when it's too low, then you have all the issues associated with that, including current draw and things of that nature. Now, it's true that this it appears on a map that this project doesn't connect to the Round Mountain substation, but there are what they call intertie lines. So there are 230 kV intertie lines that connect from Round Mountain down to Cedar Creek substation nearby, maybe 3/4 of a mile away, that do connect to these same lines that then run down to the Cottonwood substation. If you look at the 2018-19 transmission plan that the CPUC or Cal ISO put out that addressed this issue at the Round Mountain substation, when these high power lines. The primary problem is with the 500 kV lines. When they are in an over voltage condition particularly, it spreads out across the lower voltage lines, the 230, the 115, etc. So it isn't just local to Round Mountain. The problem actually spills out across the grid, and that's one reason it has such a high priority for repair. It is a safety concern, a maintenance concern, and we just don't believe that, given the state of PG&E's grid, given the regular occurrence of PSPS events. In fact, here in December, because it's a particular dry year, we were under threat, as was much of California, of having experienced a PSPS event just recently. PG&E's bankruptcy, all of those issues, the maintenance that hasn't been taken care of, that is ongoing. PG&E themselves has said it's going to take them 10 to 14 years to rectify the problem. And so now is just not the time to connect to PG&E's infrastructure, PG&E's grid, given the issues at the Round Mountain substation and throughout their system, in a high fire hazard zone such as what we live in here. Homeowners can't get fire insurance in this area. We're on the CalFire plan, most of us, and adding additional ignition sources that occur not just during operation, but actually during construction, transportation, operation and maintenance, and even decommissioning into this area is just is really kind of irresponsible when you add up all the numbers and look at it. There are better places for this type of a project than the high fire hazard forest areas of California. Another area I'd like to touch on is the local birds and bats that would be impacted by these wind turbines. A lot of people may be aware that wind turbines do kill birds and bats. They run into the blades. The bats, in fact, wind up having a vascular problem from the low pressure area around the blades, and their capillaries and stuff actually explode, or the lungs explode. So there's a problem. It kills birds and bats, and there's a significant number that die from that. One of the things you may hear a lot about is that cars and cats and buildings kill more birds than windmills do. And that's true, just if not for no other reason than the sheer number. Cats and tall buildings aren't really a problem in this area. The other thing to keep in mind when you hear that kind of information too is that the cats and buildings kill primarily the passerines, or the small songbirds. They have a much higher reproduction rate. They're able to deal with the larger loss, whereas the wind turbines affect primarily the rafters. And so your eagles, ospreys, the vultures, and other things of that nature are those that are most impacted. And the problem with those is they have a very low reproduction rate. The nearby Hatchet Ridge turbine had a 2-year post-construction study. That same method is what is being proposed for this Fountain Wind project. The problem is by then they're already built, and there isn't a significant or significantly effective mitigation method for wind turbines once they're up and operating, particularly in this area. The American Bird Conservancy considers this area a globally significant bird resource area. It's actually also part of the Pacific Flyway. One of the things that is likely to occur in here, and it was noticed on Hatchet Ridge, is during inclement weather, as the birds try to get up over the ridge out into the Fall River Valley area on their way south or north, coming the other direction, they fly lower, and there was a larger number of deaths of large birds, particularly geese, snow geese, and things of that nature, on the Hatchet Ridge project. The number of deaths per turbine was almost 2 per turbine on the Hatchet Ridge project, and about 12 bats per turbine is what they estimated. Those numbers are likely very low. When you look at the way the study was done, there's a problem there as well. Of the 44 Hatchet Ridge turbines, they only examined 22 of them, and they did that once every 2 weeks. And so if you've lived up here, you're familiar with the area, then you know that dead things don't stay on the ground very long. So 2 weeks, you'd be lucky if it stayed on the ground for 2 days with all the predators, fox, and everything else that is around here. But to make matters even worse, because there were no other wind turbines in forested lands in all of the western U.S. when they built Hatchet Ridge, they didn't have a lot to go by. They didn't know what the predation rate might be. So as a precursor to the actual count of the birds, they seeded the area with dead mice, dead rodents, to try to determine what the predation rate might be. The problem with that is that what you're basically doing is training the predators where to go for food. So you had an artificial predation rate that was probably low to begin with. By the end of your predation study, the critters are well trained, and when you start your study, they're running off with the carcasses before you can count them. The other problem they had is that they only went out 208 feet from a 416-foot tall wind turbine. So 208 foot square around the center of the wind turbine. If you think about it, you're 416 feet up. If it gets whacked by a blade that's spinning at 200 miles an hour, because the blade tip speeds are actually over 200 miles an hour at their maximum spin rate, just simple physics would tell you it's going to fall outside of the 208 feet. So the numbers, the 2 per turbine and the 12 bats per turbine are artificially low. So if you take those numbers and you then add another 72 to 100 turbines from the Fountain Wind Project, I don't think the final number is actually decided yet, and you install turbines that are, instead of 416 feet tall, they're 670 foot tall, the wind-swept area, that is of the blades, the area they cover, the diameter of the circle that they swing through is 150% larger. I mean, it's 500 feet across or more. You're going to kill a lot, and they're spread out. They're spread out across the ridges over almost 50 square mile area. It's going to be hard for the birds and bats to avoid them. And by the time you add up all of the numbers for the 20 to 30 years of cooperation of these two local wind farms in this forested area, it's going to be tens of thousands of birds killed. Many of them will be large birds, and there'd be tens of thousands of bats and thousands and thousands of birds. So again, it's just not one of those other issues that points to how this project is just not right for this area. This isn't the place to locate a project like this. Okay, probably the final area that I'll touch on will be wildfires, and there'll be other people speaking on that probably in more detail. Wildfires, as I've mentioned, are a problem in California in general, but in this area in particular, it's campfire in nearby Paradise, car fire just across Highway 5 there, and we've had numerous other fires in this area. In fact, the project is located in what was called or much of it's located in the burn scar of what was called the Fountain Fire, which burned, I think, over 60,000 acres back in the 90s. So there's a problem in California in general, and it's a growing problem of the forests and the maintenance that needs to occur in them. Placing this wind turbine in this area, adding the additional ignition sources, just isn't a wise thing to do. during the construction of the nearby Hatchet Ridge wind farm, or wind development, there were 2 fires at that time. Fortunately, they put them out rather quickly. I think one was maybe as much as 5 acres or so, and I think it had to do with the grading more than anything at that time. But windmills do catch fire. In fact, they attract lightning. And we know that much of Shasta County, in particular here in the east, we get dry lightning events. It's not uncommon. So these turbines will be, again, more than 200 feet taller than the Hatchet Ridge turbines at 670 plus feet. So they are lightning rods, and they ground them. They have grounding systems, but even that is problematic in this area because much of the soil in the area is sandy loam, and it's not real conductive. And so you have to take special care with the grounding system. Some of it requires regular maintenance. You have to check the conductivity of your grounding system regularly. And so that's another potential point of failure that could cause a fire. And even if the grounding system does work, there's usually damage, micro damage and larger, within the blades themselves. Now, with these turbines, they have proposed some sort of fire suppression system in the nacelle, which is the main motor component, the generator component up on the that the blades connect to. That will certainly help, but the problem with that is that it doesn't really help with the blades. The blades are often a composite resin-based material that burns readily. And once it starts burning, it can't be fought from the ground, and they don't fight it from the air. So they essentially let it burn, and they try to control the fire that spreads about it on the ground. Well, again, you're in a heavily forested area, and should the wind be blowing when this occurs, it could easily get out of control. So even our local fire department is rather small. We have 7 volunteer firefighters, I believe is the number at the Montgomery Creek Firehouse. And those guys are on call. They're not necessarily present all the time. So how long it might take them to actually be there on site is not certain. And the other problem with the turbines and the construction, the grading, is that they plan on blasting. So we know that blasting will likely occur in order to anchor, embed some of the anchors for these foundations for these extremely large turbines. And that, of course, can cause all kinds of problems, fire being one of them. So in addition to the blasting, we have they will have to add power lines. So there's power lines that are going to run not only to the 230 kV lines from PG&E, but between the turbines themselves. They're going to build another substation. There'll be power lines running to the substation. And again, in these forested areas, power lines are a problem. It's a known problem. It's a problem that the state itself is looking at trying to reduce. You have to maintain it regularly. Trees die, fall on the power lines. It's the whole reason why we have the PSPS events with PG&E, albeit they are behind on some of the maintenance. But even with regular maintenance, it's a issue, it's a concern, it's a risk that we don't need in this area. That's why this really is not the right place for them. So power lines, blasting, there's coal seams in this area that have been mentioned that could be ignited during any of those operations, the grading, the blasting, and that would be problematic should they catch fire. So the wind turbines themselves, even with the fire suppression system within the nacelle, they are planning to use some form of suppression that evacuates the oxygen in the nacelle. Well, you have to turn that off when the workers are up there. One of the causes of fire, well, number one being lightning, but one of the causes is hot work. And so the workers themselves would have to turn that off when they were up there doing hot work, because you don't want to evacuate the oxygen or fill the cavities with some inert gas that would suffocate them. So there are problems. It's not foolproof, and the whole system could easily start a fire up here. There's an issue with aerial firefighting with these things in place, and we have a gentleman that will speak more on that and has much more experience than I do. And so there's also the grease and the oil of the transformers that go into these things. And so this isn't the place for adding additional risk. This is a place where you'd want to maybe exploit biomass or investigate geothermal or things of that nature. So to destroy the carbon sequestering trees, and should you start a fire, all of the carbon that is emitted at that time just makes this an untenable place for these wind turbines. Another aspect with regard to these windmills and the power that it'll generate and how useful this power is to this area, particularly the PG&E service area. Locating within the PG&E service area, as I mentioned, is one of the objectives of this project. But something else to consider when you're evaluating how effective this is at reducing the carbon expenditure due to electrical generation from carbon sources or carbon producing sources such as natural gas and coal is, what is the makeup of the power used in the PG&E service territory? Well, in 2017, PG&E published an analysis of its power generation portfolio. How much of it was from renewable, how much of it was from carbon-producing sources. And it turns out that even though they're not necessarily considered renewable in California because it's above the 36 megawatts for hydro and or it's nuclear, PG&E actually produces 78% of its power from renewable sources. Only 22% is from gas. And so there is less of a benefit to be producing wind power in PG&E service territory. It's one of the reasons why PG&E isn't in the market for renewables right now. They're not looking for new portfolio contracts with renewable generators, and are good until 2030 or perhaps longer. So that is an issue to consider when looking at the carbon savings of a project like this in this forested area. Again, with regard to the energy that this project would produce, what a lot of wind developers do is they overestimate, as I believe this one has, the capacity factor that I talked about earlier, how efficient these turbines will be. One of the things that often isn't taken into account is the wind shear as well as the wake effect due to the turbulence in the air that's produced by the wind turbines. That would be the wake effect. That wake effect actually affects other turbines downwind from them, and it can affect adjacent wind developments as well. There's been lawsuits in some cases where they've reduced the power output of an adjacent wind farm. The way these wind turbines are spread about, it's quite likely that they will self-interfere, and thus reducing that power estimate that I spoke of earlier even further. That again affects how effective these are at truly reducing the carbon within this area. So wind shear, with regard to how high the turbines have to be, where is that wind shear? Typically in a forested area, there's a lot of wind turbulence. That's why the U.S. Forest Service actually recommends not placing wind turbines in forested areas. The trees, the lands themselves contribute to a lot of turbulence that makes it difficult for wind farms or wind developments to be as efficient as they should be. Again, just another reason why these should not be located in this particular area. With regard to wildfires, as I've mentioned, this is the highest fire hazard zone areas within the state, this forested areas. Homeowners can't get the homeowner insurance. The other thing about this area is that we're actually very similar in topography and in ingress and egress as was the Camp Fire in Paradise. Camp Fire had limited ways in and out of the area, Skyway, Pence Road, and a few others like that. What we have here is Highway 299, which is really nothing more than a two-lane road that winds through the local mountains here. This project will be placed on either side of 299, well, in fact, on three sides. It'll be north, south, and east of 299. And so should a fire break out from these, it can easily block that limited ingress and egress. The lands that were, or the routes that were used during the Fountain Fire back in the 90s included many of the back roads, the logging roads and things of that nature. That land has since been sold to an Australian firm, Shasta Cascade Timberlands, who currently owns it. They are the lessors for this project. Those roads are gated off, and in fact, the wind turbine farm itself or development itself will have locked gates. They have talked about being made available or being available to unlock the gates and escort people through the area, but in a raging wildfire with high winds blowing, as has happened in the camp and car fires recently, that's not something you want to count on. And the local community of Big Bend, not far from 299, and would only be a couple miles, a few miles, maybe 5, from the northernmost wind turbines at this time, unless further developments occur after this project. But even as it is, 4 or 5 miles from the northernmost wind turbines, they're down to one-lane road on Big Bend Road. And so should a fire spread into that area, there's going to be real difficulty for them getting out and emergency vehicles getting in. There are many issues that need to be addressed with regard to this wind turbine. Too many to put together succinctly for just this particular video. I think many of if you look at the DEIR itself, it's over 2,000 pages long. So there's a lot of environmental impacts, a lot of studies, a lot of data. One of the things that has not been done with regard to this project is the study by the Army Corps of Engineers, according to Section 404, part of the Clean Water Act. It needs to be assessed. They need to look at the hydrology in this area, the springs, the creeks, the rivers. I believe Beth spoke about some of this earlier. It needs to be addressed before approval, not after the fact. The county has, I'm told, done this sort of thing before, where they look at performing these sorts of studies after the project has been approved. This is one of those things that can't be easily mitigated after the fact. Many of the people up here rely on the local watershed, springs and such for their domestic supply and for agricultural use. And so the blasting and other things of that nature will likely significantly affect the local water supplies and drainage system. Finally, one of the things I wanted to talk about is alternatives. We talked about how this area is probably better suited, and there are various studies out that show that the forest lands, and in particular these forest lands in this area, in these high fire danger zones, are actually well suited for biomass generation. Geothermal is another alternative. We've suggested that this wind turbine be placed in a less carbon dense area, like grasslands or deserts or something of that sort, as many of them are here in California. We've proposed many of these objectives within the DEIR for the county to review, but they did not meet their limited objectives, which were very narrowly defined to essentially place this project here. One of the alternatives that was evaluated was moving turbines around within the project zone, and that's not really an alternative. That's a reconfiguration of the existing wind development, and that may take care of a stream here or there, or a spring here or there that was interfered with. But it doesn't really address the problem of where is the best place to place a project like this within Shasta County or within California in general. We've requested the county to take the time to evaluate and come up with a solid plan on how they want to produce or be involved in renewable energy generation. They haven't done that. There is no zoning code for this. There is no, it's not part of the general plan that really addresses where to place these and where not to place these. Again, because of the carbon density and the fire risk and so forth, these forested lands are not the place to put these wind developments. And alternatives need to be evaluated besides simply moving the wind turbines around within these high fire hazard zones.